Welcome to Sherlock Holmes and the Ghost Who Knocked Twice at Baker Street, a chilling mystery where science meets the supernatural. Have you ever heard a knock in the dark and felt fear whisper back? Tell us where you're listening from tonight. It was one of those rare evenings when Baker Street seemed almost peaceful. The fog outside pressed against the windows like a living thing, muffling the distant clatter of carriages and the mournful call of a late-night watchman. Holmes sat cross-legged in his chair, his violin resting idly beside him, while I perused a newly published medical journal. The fire burned low, its orange glow dancing across the familiar chaos of our sitting room, piles of papers, chemical vials, and the faint, comforting smell of tobacco. The clock had just struck 11 when the first knock came. It was soft, barely audible above the crackle of the fire, but distinct enough to draw Holmes' eyes upward. He frowned, listening. "You heard that, Watson?" "Indeed," I said, glancing toward the door. "A visitor at this hour?" Holmes leaned back slightly, his gaze sharpening. No carriage, no footsteps. Curious. Before I could reply, a second knock echoed precisely, 2 beats, measured and deliberate. Then, silence. Holmes rose without haste, his expression unreadable. "Twice, Watson. Precisely twice." He crossed the room and opened the door. The landing beyond was empty. Only the mist from the street lamp drifted up the stairwell, pale and cold. Holmes stood motionless, his keen eyes sweeping the shadows. Then, with a slight shrug, he closed the door. "Well, my dear fellow, it seems our visitor prefers to remain unseen." I laughed uneasily. "A prank, perhaps? Some boy from the street?" "Perhaps," he murmured, "or perhaps not." For several minutes, we returned to our seats, though I found it difficult to focus on my reading. Holmes had resumed his violin, but his playing was absent-minded, each note lingering a moment too long. His gaze drifted repeatedly toward the door, as though expecting something or someone to return. Then came the sound that froze the both of us, a faint scuffle from outside the window. Not a bird, not the wind. Something heavier. Holmes was on his feet instantly. "Stay here, Watson." Before I could protest, he had crossed to the window, drawing aside the curtain. A cold gust entered, carrying with it the unmistakable smell of damp stone and soot. Holmes peered into the fog, motionless for nearly half a minute. Then he turned back, closing the window softly. "Nothing?" I asked. "Nothing that wishes to be seen." He resumed his chair, his features illuminated by the firelight. "Watson, I should like you to make a note of this evening's events. The hour 11 o'clock precisely. 2 knocks. No visible caller. And the faint sound of movement outside the window. You believe it significant?" He smiled faintly. "I believe everything is significant until proven otherwise." The next morning, we were visited by Inspector Lestrade, whose unexpected arrival found Holmes already at his desk, examining a small scrap of something grayish that he had retrieved from the window ledge. "Good morning, gentlemen," said Lestrade, removing his hat. "I trust I'm not intruding, but we've had a most extraordinary report from Bloomsbury, something that might interest you, Mr. Holmes." Holmes gestured for him to continue. "A gentleman by the name of Mr. Percival Henshaw, well known in certain circles, was found dead in his study early this morning. No sign of forced entry. Door locked from the inside. Windows sealed. And here's the curious part, his servants swear they heard 2 distinct knocks on the door of his study moments before the discovery." I turned sharply toward Holmes. His expression did not change, though I saw his eyes flicker toward the door of our own sitting room. "2 knocks, you say?" "Yes," said Lestrade. "Twice, and then silence." Holmes leaned back, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Fascinating. And the cause of death?" Lestrade hesitated. "The doctors aren't sure. No wound, no poison detected. The man appears to have simply died of fright." Holmes rose at once, his manner brisk and purposeful. "Watson, your hat." Lestrade, have a cab ready within 5 minutes. It appears we are not the only ones visited by a ghost who knocks twice. The fire hissed as we left Baker Street, and as I glanced back, I could not help but feel that the fog outside seemed thicker, as though the city itself held its breath. The cab rattled through the dense London fog. The gas lamps along the street reduced to pale, trembling orbs of light. Holmes sat beside me in complete silence, his head bowed, fingertips pressed together beneath his chin. Only the faint jingle of the horse's harness broke the stillness. I had seen that look before, the look that meant his mind was already at work, turning over possibilities, mapping unseen connections. When we arrived at the Henshaw residence in Bloomsbury, dawn was only beginning to pale the sky. The townhouse loomed dark against the mist, its upper windows shuttered, the iron gate glistening with dew. A nervous constable admitted us and led the way through a marble-floored hall lined with portraits whose painted eyes seemed to follow our steps. The study, where the tragedy had occurred, was a grand but claustrophobic room, heavy curtains drawn, the air stale and faintly scented with cigar smoke. Mr. Percival Henshaw still sat in his armchair near the fireplace, his expression frozen in an unnatural mask of terror. The body had not yet been moved. Lestrade gestured grimly. No signs of struggle, as you can see. Door locked, windows bolted from within. Servant heard 2 knocks on the study door shortly after midnight. When no answer came, they forced it open and found him like this. Holmes advanced slowly, his gaze sweeping the room with meticulous precision. He paused before the hearth, where a thin trail of ashes extended halfway across the rug. Then he knelt beside the chair, examining Henshaw's right hand, which was clenched tightly around a crumpled piece of paper. "Permit me," he murmured. With delicate fingers, he pried it open. The note inside bore only 2 words, scrawled in uneven handwriting. "He returns." Lestrade raised an eyebrow. "Meaning what, exactly?" Holmes said nothing. His attention had shifted to a faint mark upon the carpet, a circular impression about the size of a shilling, smudged near the desk. He bent closer, sniffing the air. "Sulphur," he whispered, faint but unmistakable. I moved beside him. "Do you suppose he was poisoned?" "Unlikely. The discoloration of the lips is absent. No trace of cyanide or arsenic. And yet—" He straightened, eyes narrowing. "The residue of sulphur suggests a chemical process, or perhaps something less ordinary." Lestrade crossed his arms impatiently. "You'll forgive me, Mr. Holmes, but your something less ordinary sounds like superstition. The servants claim to have heard the same ghostly knocking every night this week." Holmes smiled thinly. "Then we must thank the spirits for their consistency. Lestrade, tell me, did anyone else have access to this room during that period?" "No one. The servants insist their master kept the key with him always." Holmes walked to the door, examining the lock with his magnifying lens. A key retained on the person of the deceased, and yet someone entered. Interesting paradox. He moved next to the bookcase, where a small bronze statue stood slightly askew. Lifting it, he revealed a narrow groove of disturbed dust beneath. "A recent movement," he murmured. "Watson, note this. The statue has been turned twice in quick succession. Once clockwise, once counter. Good heavens, Holmes. Do you think?" "I think, my dear Watson, that our ghost had a steady hand and an eye for mechanical precision." He replaced the statue and turned abruptly to Lestrade. "You mentioned the servants heard 2 knocks on the door last night. Did anyone observe where Mr. Henshaw was seated at that exact moment?" "In his chair, sir, according to the butler, reading." "Indeed. Then he would not have risen to answer. Yet the knocks ceased instantly, suggesting the visitor knew he was within." Holmes's voice dropped to a murmur. "We are dealing, I suspect, not with a supernatural visitor, but with one who understood the mechanism of fear." He pocketed the note, retrieved the scrap of grey residue he had found earlier at Baker Street, and compared it beneath the morning light. A subtle gleam passed through his expression. "The same material," he said quietly. A rare industrial compound used in matchmaking factories, phosphorus-laden dust. Lestrade blinked. So, what are you saying, that a factory worker frightened this man to death? Holmes gave a small, enigmatic smile. No, Lestrade. I am saying that whoever stood at his door last night was no ghost, but a man very much alive and clever enough to make death itself knock twice. We left the room in silence, the chill of dawn creeping through the windows. I could not shake the sensation that something unseen had brushed past us, a shadow, perhaps, or the faint echo of those mysterious knocks that had begun this dreadful affair. Holmes, however, seemed wholly untouched by such notions. His mind was already racing ahead toward the next piece of the puzzle. Holmes spent several moments in stillness once we were outside the Henshaw residence, the faint glimmer of dawn now spreading along the misted rooftops of Bloomsbury. He lit a cigarette, inhaled deeply, and began pacing the cobbled street, his coat collar raised against the chill. "Watson," he said quietly, "when a man dies of terror, one must first ask what vision could be terrible enough to destroy reason itself." His eyes gleamed in the dim light. And then, who orchestrated that vision? We returned to the cab, and the drive back to Baker Street was filled with the rhythmic tapping of Holmes's fingers against his knee, a sure sign of agitation. "The mechanism is clever," he murmured. "Too clever for the ordinary criminal mind. I must learn what Mr. Henshaw feared most while alive." Upon reaching Baker Street, Holmes immediately went to his chemical bench, emptying a pinch of the greyish residue from a small glass vial onto a slide. I observed him through the rising steam of my morning tea. "Phosphorus dust," he confirmed after a moment's scrutiny under the lens. "But not common. It contains traces of antimony used in a new line of self-igniting matches manufactured only in the East End." I frowned. "Then our mysterious visitor might have come from the factories?" "Not necessarily from the workers themselves," Holmes replied, "but from someone who understands the nature of fire and of fear. Do you recall the sulfur smell in the study? It lingers when phosphorus ignites under pressure or heat. Imagine 2 deliberate knocks, the door locked, and suddenly a faint illumination enough to suggest the supernatural to a mind already overwrought." He turned sharply toward me. "Henshaw was not merely frightened, Watson. He was conditioned to be frightened. Someone prepared him." Before I could ask more, a knock sounded from below, this one brisk and entirely human. Mrs. Hudson entered moments later, carrying a small envelope sealed in black wax. "A boy left this, Mr. Holmes," she said. "Wouldn't give his name." Holmes took the envelope and examined the seal under the lamplight. "The same impression as before," he muttered, half to himself. "A raven's wing." He broke the wax and unfolded the note. Again, only 2 words. "He knocks." Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then Holmes smiled faintly. "The game is progressing. Our adversary has a flair for the theatrical." We were still studying the message when Lestrade returned, his boots damp from the morning fog. "We've checked the servants, Mr. Holmes. None of them left the house last night. But we did find something odd in the back garden, a set of footprints leading to the study window, then vanishing halfway across the lawn." "Vanishing?" Holmes repeated. "Exactly so. They simply end, as if the man took flight." Holmes seized his hat and coat. "Watson, fetch your revolver. There is no ghost, Lestrade, but someone wishes us to believe there is. The footprints will tell us more than the man who left them ever intended." When we reached the Henshaw garden once more, the fog hung heavy across the grass, muffling every sound. Holmes crouched beside the final footprint, running his finger along the edge. "Cut clean into the earth," he said softly. "A hollow imprint, leather sole, fine stitching." The man was light on his feet, no more than 9 stone. He pressed deeper into the soil, then looked up suddenly. "Ah. Here we have it, resin residue from a theatrical boot." I stared. "Theatrical?" "Yes. The sort used in stage illusions, designed to leave a false impression under controlled light. He straightened, his eyes shining with sudden clarity. "Watson, our phantom is no ghost at all, it is an actor," Lestrade groaned. "An actor? Then what of the vanishing?" Holmes gestured toward the shrubbery. "Observe, a length of black cloth, nearly invisible in this fog. Our man carried a folding screen or backdrop, a trick of perspective. When the light caught it, the illusion was complete. Mr. Henshaw saw what he was meant to see, an apparition that seemed to step from thin air. He turned toward the house, his expression grave. "We are dealing with a mind well versed in deceit and stagecraft, a man who knows how to turn fear into performance." He paused, tapping the folded note against his hand. "And if my reasoning is correct, Watson, our next encounter will not be in a drawing room, but behind the velvet curtain of a London theatre." The words lingered in the air, heavy with promise and foreboding, as the first bells of morning began to toll across the city. That same evening, we found ourselves seated in a dimly lit tavern off Drury Lane, a short walk from the heart of London's theatre district. Holmes had insisted we dine there, though I suspected food was the last thing on his mind. His sharp eyes flickered from table to table, taking in the faces of actors, stagehands, and costumers who crowded the smoky room. The smell of grease paint and stale ale mingled with the air, and outside, a light rain began to fall against the cobblestones. "This," Holmes murmured, "is the breeding ground of illusions, Watson, where truth hides behind a painted smile." I sipped my brandy and leaned forward. "You believe our phantom hails from among these people?" "I do not believe, I observe," he replied. "The footprints at Henshaw's garden bore resin from a particular kind of stage boot used in productions involving quick changes or ghostly apparitions. There are perhaps 4 theatres in London employing such equipment, but only one has a special act known as the Man Who Vanishes." "The Egyptian theatre?" I guessed, recalling a review I had read weeks earlier. A rare smile curved Holmes's lips. "Precisely. And the performer's name is Silas Rook, a conjurer of no small reputation, though of late his fortunes have waned. A man of cunning, adept at deception, and formerly acquainted with Mr. Henshaw, if my sources are correct." Before I could ask how he knew that, the door to the tavern swung open. A gust of rain-scented air swept through as a man in a long coat and theatre scarf entered, shaking the water from his hat. Holmes' gaze fixed instantly upon him. "And fortune smiles upon us," he whispered. "For that, my dear Watson, is Mr. Rook himself." The illusionist crossed the room with measured grace, his pale face framed by dark hair, eyes sharp and restless. He greeted several patrons before taking a seat alone near the back. Holmes rose quietly. "You will, of course, accompany me." We approached his table, and Rook looked up with a faintly mocking smile. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, unless my eyes deceive me. To what do I owe the honor?" Holmes inclined his head politely. "A brief matter of curiosity. A man named Percival Henshaw is dead. You knew him." Rook's smile froze, then faded. "I knew of him. A patron once, when my performances drew applause instead of ridicule." He gestured to the empty glass before him. "But what has his misfortune to do with me?" Holmes's tone was mild, yet his gaze was unrelenting. "He died in his locked study after 2 knocks on the door, an act most peculiar. You, sir, are known for conjuring ghosts that knock from beyond the stage curtain. I find coincidence an untrustworthy companion." Rook laughed softly, though the sound lacked mirth. "You think I frightened him to death with some trick of theatre magic? How flattering. But, Mr. Holmes, do you also think I walked through locked doors? You are a man who thrives on illusion," Holmes said quietly. "And illusion often conceals darker truths." The conjurer's expression shifted, his eyes glinting with sudden defiance. "You hunt for meaning where there is only despair. Henshaw destroyed me, as he destroyed others. He withdrew his patronage, ruined my name, and stole something that was mine. And what, precisely, was stolen? Holmes asked softly. Rook hesitated, then said, "A design, a mechanism I created to produce the illusion of a spirit's touch." He claimed it, patented it under his own name, and profited handsomely. "Tell me, Mr. Holmes, when justice is denied, is vengeance not merely another form of truth?" Holmes' eyes did not waver. "You speak eloquently, Mr. Rook, but eloquence is no alibi. Where were you at midnight last night?" Rook smiled faintly again. "On stage, naturally. My audience can attest. Though," he added with a chilling calm, "ghosts do not always require their masters to guide them." Holmes said nothing further. We left the tavern moments later, the night pressing close around us. As we walked toward the cab, I caught a rare tension in Holmes's expression, a flicker of unease, perhaps even doubt. "He's lying," I said at last. "Undoubtedly," Holmes murmured. "But whether he lies about his guilt or his innocence remains to be seen. For now, Watson, we watch. And if I am correct, the ghost who knocked twice has not yet finished his performance." The rain fell harder, cloaking the streets in silver. Somewhere, far off, a church bell tolled midnight again, and Holmes stopped, glancing back into the fog with the faintest trace of a smile. "Listen closely, my dear friend. The second act has begun." We returned to Baker Street before dawn, the gas lamps flickering against the window panes as Holmes paced in front of the hearth. He moved with restless precision, every step timed with the rhythm of his thoughts. "Rook is a master of misdirection," he said at last, "but he made one error tonight. He underestimated his audience." I watched him curiously as he threw open his desk drawer and withdrew a stack of theatre bills, each marked with the same elaborate crest, a raven with wings outstretched. "Watson," he continued, spreading them across the table, "observe the pattern. The emblem appears not only on Rook's advertisements, but also on the wax seal of the letters we've received. Coincidence? I think not. Whoever orchestrates these events wishes us to associate the image with dread, to brand the ghost's identity into the victim's mind before the act occurs." I leaned closer. "Then Rook used his old stage symbol to terrify Henshaw?" Holmes' expression darkened. "That is one possibility. But there is something deeper, an intelligence working beneath the surface. Fear alone cannot kill. There must have been an agency, an influence, acting upon the mind or body at the moment of death." Before I could press further, a sharp knock came at the door, 2 firm raps, evenly spaced. "Mrs. Hudson's voice followed nervously from the hall. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. Says it's urgent." Holmes glanced at me, his eyes narrowing. "2 knocks, Watson. The theatre continues." The visitor was a man of about 40, plainly dressed, but visibly shaken. He introduced himself as Edmund Gray, the stage manager of the Egyptian Theatre. "Mr. Holmes," he said, wringing his hands, I heard of your visit to Mr. Rook tonight. There's something you must know. One of our prop men, Elias Gorse, vanished 3 nights ago. He was responsible for preparing Rook's mechanical illusions. No one's seen him since." Holmes gestured for him to sit. "And you believe this disappearance is connected to Mr. Henshaw's death?" Gray swallowed hard. "I do. Gorse had been working on something peculiar, a device that mimicked a human knock from a distance. He called it his echo machine. Rook dismissed it as nonsense, but Gorse insisted it could be used to create the sound of a ghost's hand striking a door." Holmes's eyes lit with sudden fire. "A mechanism for artificial knocking ingenious. Watson, that explains the consistency of the sound reported at both locations. It was not human, but mechanical." He turned back to Gray. "Where was Gorse last seen?" "At the theatre, sir. He left after a rehearsal, carrying a small case of instruments. The next morning, we found his locker broken open, and this." From his coat pocket, the man drew a folded scrap of paper and handed it to Holmes. It bore the same chilling inscription as before. "He knocks." Holmes studied it for several seconds, then slipped it into his notebook. "Tell me, Mr. Gray, what of Rook's demeanor since this disappearance?" Gray hesitated. "Strange, almost fearful. He's been rehearsing alone after midnight, locking the stage doors behind him. Last night I heard him shouting into the empty theater, swearing that something was following him." Holmes rose abruptly. "Watson, fetch your coat. We go to the Egyptian theater at once. Our phantom, it seems, has turned on its creator." The streets were silent as we crossed the Strand, the drizzle clinging to our faces like cold breath. When we reached the theater, its grand facade loomed over us, dark except for a single light glowing behind the curtains. Holmes motioned for silence. We slipped inside through a side door, our footsteps muffled by the velvet carpet. The smell of dust and oil hung thick in the air. From somewhere deep within came the echo of 2 slow knocks, not loud but deliberate. Holmes stiffened, eyes gleaming with the light of the hunt. "There it is. Watson," he whispered. "The ghost performs again." We crept toward the stage, and through the gloom, I saw a figure standing motionless under the spotlight, a man in a long coat, his head bowed. As Holmes took a step forward, the figure raised its arm, and the sound came once more, 2 measured knocks that reverberated through the empty theater. "Stay back," Holmes hissed, his voice low but firm. "We are no longer spectators in this drama. The final act, Watson, has just begun." Holmes moved like a shadow, each step precise, silent, and filled with purpose. The dim light of the stage seemed to warp the figure before us, turning its stillness into something uncanny. Then, with a soft click, the spotlight flickered and the figure vanished. Not a movement, not a sound. One moment there, the next, swallowed by darkness. I felt the hair rise on my neck. "Good Lord, Holmes," I whispered. "Did you see?" "Yes, Watson," he breathed, and so did he. His eyes were fixed not on the stage but on the side corridor, where faint, hurried footsteps echoed in retreat. "Follow me." We moved swiftly through the maze of backstage passages, past discarded props and tattered curtains. The knocking resumed closer now, insistent, echoing against the wooden panels, as though the walls themselves were alive. 2 deliberate raps, a pause, then silence. Holmes raised his hand, motioning for me to stop. "Listen carefully. The rhythm is mechanical constant in its interval." He pressed his ear to the wall, tracing the sound downward until his hand came to rest on a metal grill near the baseboard. "Ah, ingenious," he murmured. "A concealed conduit running beneath the stage." He knelt and drew out his knife, levering open the panel. Beneath lay a narrow compartment containing a small brass mechanism fitted with coiled wires and a spring hammer that struck rhythmically against the wood. The device gave one final pair of knocks before slowing to a halt. Holmes lifted it delicately into the light. "The missing invention," he said softly. "Elias Gorse's echo machine. Our ghost's beating heart." Before I could respond, a soft creak came from the wings. A man's voice, low, tense, spoke from the darkness. "Put that down, Mr. Holmes." We turned to see Silas Rook emerging into the half-light, a pistol trembling in his hand. His once confident expression was now that of a haunted man, his eyes hollow, his face slick with sweat. Holmes regarded him coolly. "You have rehearsed this scene poorly, Mr. Rook. A trembling hand ruins the illusion." Rook's laugh was brittle. "You think I killed Henshaw? You think this contraption was mine to command? No, Holmes, I tell you I am as cursed as he was. It follows me. It being your conscience, perhaps?" Holmes replied evenly. "You built the device, set the stage, and preyed upon Henshaw's guilt, but something went awry, did it not? The trick escaped the trickster." Rook shook his head violently. "You don't understand. Gorse built another and improved one. I heard it last night, knocking beneath my floorboards. I smashed it to pieces, but still it came again." His eyes darted wildly across the theater. "He's here, Holmes. Gorse is here." Holmes stepped forward, his voice calm but commanding. Gorse is dead, Mr. Rook. Of that I have little doubt, but his creation remains, and someone, alive and calculating, has used it to drive both you and Henshaw toward madness." At that instant, a cold draught swept through the theatre, and from the rafters came another sound, 2 sharp knocks echoing above us. Rook cried out, firing blindly into the shadows. Splinters of wood burst from the stage wall as the shot rang through the empty building. Holmes lunged forward, disarming him with swift precision. The pistol clattered to the floor. From above, a rope swung loose, and something small dropped onto the boards with a dull metallic clink, a second echo device, identical to the first, still ticking faintly. Holmes bent to retrieve it, the faintest hint of grim satisfaction on his face. "So," he said, turning to the trembling illusionist, "we now have 2 ghosts, and both of man's own making." Rook fell to his knees, his voice cracking. "It wasn't me, Holmes. I swear it. He wanted revenge. He said Henshaw would pay first, and then He," Holmes repeated quietly, "meaning Gorse." Rook nodded frantically. "Yes. But he vanished. No one saw him again." Holmes pocketed the second device and straightened. "Then perhaps it is time we looked for him where the living seldom care to tread. Fear not, Mr. Rook, the stage may yet have one last performance to offer." Outside, the fog was beginning to thicken once more, curling around the theatre doors like a living veil. As we stepped into the cold night air, Holmes glanced upward, his face half lost in shadow. "Watson," he said softly, "we have been following a ghost of invention, but I suspect the true phantom walks still among us, and he will knock again before this play is done." The following morning found Holmes and me back in Baker Street, the 2 echo devices laid out before him like relics of some unholy science. He examined them beneath his lens, turning each with delicate precision while the grey London light filtered through the curtains. The faint clink of metal was the only sound until Holmes finally spoke, his tone measured but heavy with thought. "They are identical in construction, yet subtly different in purpose. The first is crude, an early prototype. The second, however," he tapped the smaller device with the tip of his penknife, "contains a vial of compressed gas attached to a fuse, not merely an instrument for sound, Watson, but a tool designed to ignite under specific conditions." "Then Henshaw's death was not mere fright," Holmes interrupted. "The sulfur, the phosphorus residue, both byproducts of a reaction. I believe the device emitted a faint glow before detonation, just enough to simulate a supernatural manifestation. Imagine, Watson, a man seated alone, a mysterious knocking at his door, and then an eerie light filling the room. For a heart already burdened with guilt, the terror would be absolute." I felt a chill as his words sank in. "So Gorse's invention was used to kill him?" Holmes's gaze hardened. "Yes, though not by Gorse himself. The craftsmanship here shows refinement, added features, modifications." Someone continued his work. At that moment, a rap at the door startled us both, not 2 knocks, but 3. Mrs. Hudson entered, visibly uneasy. "A constable brought this, Mr. Holmes. Said it was found outside the Egyptian Theatre this morning." She handed over a small envelope, the seal marked once again with the raven's wing. Holmes broke it open and unfolded the single sheet within. Written in spidery script were the words, "He knocks for the living now." I felt the back of my neck prickle. "A warning." Holmes shook his head. "A declaration. Whoever orchestrates this wishes us to know the game continues." He slipped the note into his pocket and rose abruptly. "Watson, I must see what the living have to say about the dead. The theatre may be silent now, but the dead seldom rest where art has imitated life too closely." By noon, we stood once again inside the Egyptian Theatre. The day's rehearsal had been cancelled, and the place lay cloaked in dust and shadows. Holmes moved slowly along the rows of seats, his eyes tracing invisible patterns. "Observe the gas lamps above the stage, Watson," he murmured, "each fitted with a custom glass shade, no ordinary fitting, but tinted for optical effect. When ignited with phosphorus vapor, it would produce a spectral glow of pale blue. Our murderer is both chemist and dramatist. From behind us came a hesitant voice. Mr. Holmes? It was Edmund Gray, the stage manager who had visited us before. He looked pale and exhausted, as if he had not slept. There's been another disappearance, Rook. He failed to appear for rehearsal, and his lodgings were found empty. His coat and hat gone, but his trunk left behind. Holmes' expression remained unreadable. Show me the trunk. Gray led us backstage, where the trunk sat open beside a half-collapsed dressing table. Inside lay sheets of paper covered with erratic handwriting notes, diagrams, fragments of what appeared to be mechanical sketches. Holmes sifted through them carefully, his eyes darting from one to the next. These are not Rook's, he said finally. The penmanship matches that of Gorse's letter to the theatre director 2 months ago. Watson, do you see? The man never left London. You mean Gorse is alive? I mean, Holmes replied, that he has been here all along, using Rook as his unwitting accomplice. Henshaw betrayed him. Rook discarded his work, and now, from the shadows, he delivers justice with the precision of a stage cue. As if summoned by the words, the theatre suddenly plunged into darkness. Somewhere high above, the faint echo of 2 knocks reverberated through the rafters. A hiss followed a soft exhalation of gas. The air filled with a faint, sickly glow. Holmes seized my arm. Quickly, Watson, cover your mouth. The mechanism's active again. He darted toward the stage, where a small metallic sphere glimmered faintly beneath a chair. With one swift motion, he kicked it aside and smothered it beneath his cloak. The light died instantly, leaving only the ghostly echo of our breathing. Elementary, he murmured, straightening his coat. Our phantom is not yet finished. But he has shown his hand. Gorse intends to make his final appearance soon, and this time, Watson, the audience will be us. The air inside the Egyptian theatre had grown cold, carrying with it the faint tang of metal and something older dust, perhaps, or the scent of fear itself. Holmes stood motionless on the stage, his face lit dimly by the light that crept through the high windows. His voice, when he spoke, was measured and calm, though beneath it I could hear the sharpened edge of anticipation. Gorse is not a man who kills in haste, Watson. His crimes are orchestrations, acts performed with precision and audience in mind. We have just survived his overture. What follows will be his grand finale. I glanced warily about the theatre, every shadow seeming to tremble. But if he's alive, Holmes, where could he possibly be hiding? Scotland Yard scoured the place after his disappearance. Holmes's gaze remained fixed on the orchestra pit. A man who built devices of such intricacy would not confine himself to common ground. He would require privacy, a workshop, tools, and silence, somewhere beneath us. Watson. He strode to the side of the stage and began tapping the floorboards with his cane, listening for a change in tone. After a moment, there came a hollow echo from near the corner, faint but distinct. He said quietly, "Help me lift it." Together we pried open a section of the boards, revealing a narrow passage descending into darkness. A gust of stale air rose from below. Holmes lit his lantern, and we descended the creaking steps into what felt like the bowels of the city. The tunnel smelled of oil and dust. The stone walls lined with discarded stage props, old masks, painted columns, the skeletal remains of forgotten sets. But as we moved deeper, the theatrical detritus gave way to something else. Benches littered with tools, blueprints pinned to the walls, and on one table a collection of metallic devices half completed, each bearing the same distinctive hammer mechanism as the echo machine. Holmes examined them in silence, his eyes moving swiftly over the room. "Behold," he murmured, "the workshop of a ghost." A movement in the shadows made us turn sharply. At the far end of the chamber stood a man, thin, pale, his clothing torn and smeared with dust. His eyes, sunken yet burning with a strange intensity, fixed on Holmes. "You should not have come here," he said. His voice was hoarse but carried an eerie calm. The performance was not meant for you. Holmes took a single step forward, his lantern casting long, shifting shapes across the walls. Elias Gorse, I presume. Your hand has been in every act of this macabre drama, from Henshaw's death to Rook's vanishing. Gorse's mouth curved faintly. Rook was a thief, Henshaw a traitor. They built their fortunes on my genius and left me to rot in the dark, but I have returned their cruelty in kind. I gave them what they feared most, the sound of their own guilt knocking at their door. I saw his hand tighten around a small brass device resting on the table beside him. Holmes's voice remained calm, almost gentle. You have used science to mimic terror, Mr. Gorse, but in doing so, you have become the very thing you despised, a conjurer of fear. Your victims may have wronged you, but their deaths were art, Gorse cried, his eyes blazing. You think I sought mere revenge? No, I sought perfection, a performance the world would never forget. The ghost who knocks twice, the unseen hand that punishes betrayal, this was my masterpiece. Holmes's gaze hardened. And what of Rook? Did he too die for your art? Gorse hesitated, his composure faltering. He was weak. He tried to destroy my work. His words caught in his throat. He will not ruin it again. At that moment, a faint sound reached us, the slow creak of the trapdoor above. Holmes turned sharply, lantern raised, just as a figure dropped silently into the room. It was Rook, pale and trembling, a revolver gripped in his shaking hand. You were wrong, Gorse, he rasped. The masterpiece ends tonight. Holmes moved instinctively between them. Rook, put that weapon down. The law will. But Rook's voice broke through, raw and desperate. The law. Where was the law when he made me his accomplice? When he forced me to send those cursed letters? His hand trembled. You killed Henshaw. You made me part of it. I'll not carry your ghost any longer. Gorse stepped forward, raising the device in his hand. You'll carry it until you die, he hissed, pressing a switch. A shrill ticking filled the air, followed by a faint hiss. The smell of phosphorus thickened. Holmes seized my shoulder. Down, Watson, he shouted. In the same instant, he hurled the lantern across the room, shattering it against the stone floor. Darkness consumed us, broken only by the brief flare of blue light as Gorse's device erupted in a burst of sparks. The echo of two loud knocks thundered through the chamber, then silence. When the smoke cleared, Rook stood frozen, his revolver lowered. Gorse lay crumpled beside the table, the device shattered in his hand, a thin wisp of smoke curling from his sleeve. Holmes knelt beside him, feeling for a pulse, then shook his head. The ghost, he murmured, has played his final scene. Rook dropped the pistol and staggered backward, collapsing against the wall. He meant to kill us both, he said weakly. He said only through death could the performance be complete. Holmes rose, brushing dust from his coat. And yet, he said softly, it is the living who must suffer the encore. He turned to me. Watson, see that Lestrade receives word at once. This matter is ended, but the theatre will echo with its ghosts for many nights to come. The light of London breaking pale across the rooftops, I looked back one last time at the stage below. It seemed almost peaceful now, the curtains still, the air quiet. Yet in that silence, I fancied I could still hear it. Two faint, measured knocks, fading slowly into memory. The morning after the grim conclusion beneath the Egyptian theatre, Baker Street seemed unusually silent. The familiar clatter of wheels outside was softened by fog, and the coal fire burned low, casting a tired glow upon Holmes's face as he sat in his chair, motionless except for the faint twitch of his fingers upon the armrest. The events of the night had left even him subdued. The theatre, the devices, the confrontation it had, all carried a weight that clung to the air like smoke. I poured him a cup of coffee and placed it beside him, but he gave no sign of noticing. At last he spoke, his voice low and distant. You recall, Watson, that I said fear was a contagion. It spreads faster than disease, thrives upon silence, and when it takes hold of a mind already fractured, it can destroy utterly. That, my dear fellow, is precisely what we witnessed last night, a contagion of terror, engineered by intellect, sustained by guilt. I nodded, taking my seat opposite him. And yet, I said, there is something that troubles me still. Rook's role. He may not have killed Henshaw himself, but surely he aided in the crime. Holmes stirred, finally reaching for the cup. Aiding, yes, but unwillingly. Gorse was a master manipulator. He preyed upon desperation. Rook's career had fallen into ruin, and he was haunted by debts and disgrace. Gorse offered him both redemption and revenge. The man was weak, not wicked. There is a distinction, though the law seldom recognizes it. He rose suddenly and crossed to the mantelpiece, where the broken fragments of one of the echo devices lay upon a white cloth. With a pair of tweezers, he lifted a small metallic shard. This, he said, was the true key to Gorse's genius and his undoing. I leaned forward. The mechanism. Precisely. Observe the fracture along the edge, too deliberate for accident. Someone tampered with it. When he triggered the device last night, it ignited prematurely. Death came by his own hand, but not entirely of his own making. A cold realization crept over me. You think Rook altered it? Holmes's eyes gleamed faintly in the firelight. I think Rook, in a moment of lucid terror, decided that his tormentor's final act would be his last. He changed the fuse, shortened the wire, and let the ghost claim its creator. The irony would have pleased Gorse had he lived to recognize it. He set the shard back, upon the table, his expression unreadable. Lestrade will arrive shortly to collect the devices. He will doubtless attribute everything to madness and trickery, and in that he will not be wrong. Yet there is more here, Watson. Something that speaks to the darker corners of human reason. Gorse used science to give shape to guilt, and fear to command obedience. That, I think, is a power few men should ever seek. Before I could respond, there came a familiar knock at the door, thankfully not the measured double tap that had haunted our nights. Lestrade entered, looking both weary and smug, his boots still dusted from the street. "Morning, Mr. Holmes. I've been down at the yard half the night sorting your mess. Quite the scene, that theatre of yours. The press are already calling it The Ghost of Drury Lane." Holmes gave a faint smile. A fitting title, though a touch melodramatic. "And Rook, in custody," Lestrade replied. "Confessed enough to hang himself twice over. Says he was under Gorse's control. Claims the man blackmailed him with threats of exposure and ruin. Whether true or not, the Crown won't waste much sympathy on an actor who consorted with a killer." Holmes took a slow draw on his pipe before answering. "Pity. The man is as much victim as villain. Still, justice, like theatre, requires its conclusion." Lestrade frowned. "You mean to say you pity him, after all this?" "I pity any man," Holmes said softly, "who loses himself in pursuit of illusion. There was method in Gorse's madness, but Rook merely sought to survive it. Tell the Yard he is not to be hanged for invention's shadow." Lestrade muttered something about leniency and paperwork, then departed as brusquely as he had come. The door closed behind him, and for a moment all that could be heard was the faint ticking of the clock upon the mantel. Holmes leaned back in his chair, smoke curling about his head like thought made visible. "Watson," he said suddenly, "did you hear that?" I froze. Somewhere, faint but unmistakable, two soft knocks echoed from beyond the sitting-room door. I half rose, my pulse quickening. Good heavens! But Holmes raised a hand, motioning for silence. He crossed to the door and opened it sharply. The corridor beyond was empty. Only Mrs. Hudson stood at the foot of the stairs, holding a folded newspaper. "It's just me, Mr. Holmes," she said with mild reproach. "And I didn't knock twice, I assure you." He took the paper, his eyes scanning it swiftly. "Thank you, Mrs. Hudson." When she had gone, he turned to me with that familiar glint of amusement. "The imagination, Watson. Once awakened, it seldom sleeps." He tossed the paper onto the table, but I caught the headline before it fell. Mystery at the Egyptian Theatre Ghost Rumour Spreads in London's East End. As dusk settled that evening, Holmes seemed uncharacteristically reflective. "There is one thing that continues to fascinate me about this affair," he said, lighting another cigarette. "The ghost who knocked twice was never real, and yet his echo has already entered the minds of hundreds. Fear travels faster than fact." He glanced toward the window, where fog pressed close against the glass like a living curtain. "I suspect," he murmured, "that London will be hearing those knocks for some time yet." I smiled faintly. "And you, Holmes? Will you be haunted by them?" He regarded me for a long moment, then shook his head. "No, Watson. A ghost cannot haunt a man who does not believe in one, but it can, perhaps, remind him that reason, like light, must be kindled again each morning." The fire crackled softly, its glow reflected in the glass. Outside, the city was swallowed by mist, and far away, too far, perhaps to be real, came what might have been the faintest echo of two measured knocks fading into the night. The night deepened into a silence that felt almost deliberate, as though London itself had paused to listen to the echo of what had passed. I remained by the window, watching the last traces of fog curl against the glass, while Holmes sat motionless in his chair. His eyes, half closed, fixed on the embers in the hearth. He looked neither tired nor triumphant, merely thoughtful, as though some lingering shadow of the case had followed him home. At length he spoke, his tone quiet but precise. "You see, Watson, there lies the true peril of intellect divorced from conscience. Gorse had the mind of a scientist and the soul of an artist, yet no moral compass to guide either. Once fear became his instrument, he could no longer distinguish between creation and cruelty." I stirred the fire and watched it flare, the flames catching the edge of his features. "You speak of him almost with pity." "Pity is the correct word," Holmes said. "He was driven, yes, but by isolation as much as ambition. The world mocked him, rejected his genius, and thus he sought validation in terror. A pitiful end, yet one he orchestrated with perfect logic. It is always the same pattern: intellect devoured by obsession." He leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "I confess, there was a moment, standing in that dark chamber beneath the stage, when I almost admired him. Imagine it, the ghost who knocks twice, a manifestation of guilt made mechanical. A mind capable of building such horror could just as easily have built wonder. And yet he chose vengeance." I regarded him closely. "And Rook? Will he hang?" Holmes exhaled slowly. "Lestrade will see to that, though I suspect the courts will find mercy in his confession. He is no longer dangerous. Fear has done its work upon him too. When I looked into his eyes after Gorse fell, I saw a man already sentenced, haunted, hollowed, incapable of ever standing on a stage again." The hours passed in quiet reflection. The fog outside thickened, wrapping Baker Street in stillness. I had begun to think the matter concluded when a sudden commotion in the street below drew our attention. The sound of hurried footsteps, a shout, then the sharp crack of glass breaking. Holmes rose immediately. His instincts reignited. "Watson, quickly." We stepped into the misty street, just as two constables rounded the corner. Between them, staggering and pale, was Edmund Gray, the stage manager from the Egyptian Theatre. His clothes were torn, and his hands trembled violently. "Mr. Holmes," he cried. "It's alive again, the knocking, it's there." Holmes steadied him. "Compose yourself, man. What do you mean alive again?" "They sealed the theatre this morning," Gray gasped. "No one was inside, yet the watchman swore he heard it 2 knocks, just as before, and the lights blew, flickering just for a moment. I felt a chill creep up my spine. Holmes, however, only narrowed his eyes. "You are certain no one entered?" "Certain, sir. The doors were locked, and the constable kept the key." Holmes turned to me. "We go at once, Watson. If the ghost persists, it is because someone wishes us to believe it does." The theatre loomed darker than before, its marble facade swallowed by the fog. Inside, the air was thick with dust and silence. Holmes's lantern threw thin blades of light across the empty stage as we advanced. Every sound, our steps, our breath, seemed amplified in the stillness. Then, faint but unmistakable, came the sound. 2 measured knocks echoing from beneath the boards. Gray clutched his coat. "There. You hear it?" Holmes motioned for silence. He stepped forward, knelt, and pressed his ear to the stage floor. The faintest hum of electricity trembled through the wood. His expression hardened. "Ah, so the curtain truly hasn't fallen after all." He rose swiftly, following the sound toward the rear of the stage. The knocking repeated, slower now, almost rhythmic like a heartbeat fading away. Holmes crouched beside a trapdoor and pried it open. Below, a dim light flickered a small lantern, wired crudely to a battery. At its base lay another of Gorse's devices, half melted, the fuse still faintly smoldering. "Not supernatural, then," I said quietly. Holmes shook his head. "No. Mechanical memory. The current from the theater's gas line wiring must have reactivated the mechanism when the lamps were lit outside. A ghost only of science, not of spirit." He extinguished the fuse with his boot and turned to Gray, whose expression hovered between relief and dread. "You may rest easy, Mr. Gray. London's ghosts will trouble you no longer, at least, none of human making." As we stepped back into the night, the fog began to lift, revealing the first faint glimmer of dawn. Holmes paused on the pavement, watching the horizon with that familiar, detached calm. "Curious thing, Watson," he said softly. "The world delights in ghosts because it cannot bear the thought that terror springs from within itself. It is easier to blame the unseen than to face the truth that fear, like invention, begins in the mind." I looked back once more at the theater doors, now dark and silent. "Then this truly ends the matter?" He smiled faintly, drawing his coat close against the morning chill. "For now. But London, my dear Watson, has endless stages and an infinite supply of actors. Another curtain will rise, another illusion will walk. And when it does," he glanced toward me, and his eyes bright beneath the brim of his hat, "we shall be in the audience once again." We returned to Baker Street as the city stirred awake, the sound of hoofbeats echoing softly through the streets. Holmes set his violin upon his knee and drew the bow across the strings. The notes that followed were low and mournful, yet strangely resolute music that carried both closure and continuation. As I listened, pen in hand, I realized that the case of the ghost who knocked twice at Baker Street would be one I could never forget. For though the phantom had been laid to rest, its echo, like all great mysteries, lingered still, quietly knocking in the corridors of memory.